Good afternoon. Thank you for attending our event today. My name is Desmond Arias. I am the director of the Bildner Center for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Our guest today is Jo Marie Burt. She is an associate professor of political science at George Mason University. Throughout her academic career, she has engaged in public policy debates and with a special focus on human rights. She is a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, where she engages in research-based advocacy on human rights and transitional justice. In 2016, she founded and co-directs the Verdad y Justicia in Guatemala, which monitors and reports on human rights trials in Guatemala. Dr. Burt is president of the Latin American Studies Association, which will be hosting its annual conference in Bogota, Colombia this year, of which she has invited me to be co-program director. Dr. Burt's early research focused on state and insurgent violence in Peru. Her 2007 book, Silencing Civil Society, Political Violence and the Authoritarian State in Peru, received an honorable mention for the Wola Duke Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America. Grupo Planeta published this book in revised version in Spanish. She is also the co-editor of Politics in the Andes, Identity, Conflict, and Reform. Currently, Dr. Burt's work, which you will be presenting on today, focuses on human rights, transitional justice, and historical memory. Her work explores the efforts of victims of grave human rights abuse to access justice. She has been an international observer to the trials of former heads of state Alberto Fujimori in Peru and Efraín Ríos Montt in Guatemala, and organized several international delegations to monitor these proceedings. She has written extensively in scholarly and journalistic outlets about these and other human rights trials and their local and global significance, including transitional justice in the aftermath of civil conflict, lessons from Peru, Guatemala, and El Salvador. She is completing a manuscript entitled "We Only Want to Be Human: Victims in Pursuit of Justice in Post-War Guatemala." Dr. Burt has received grants and fellowships from the Open Society Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the United States Institute of Peace, the Aston Institute, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Inter-American Foundation, the Tinker Foundation, the Institute for the Study of World Politics, and the Robert J. Watson Foundation. So without further ado, Jo Marie Burt.
Thank you, Desmond, for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. And yes, Desmond and I have been seeing each other almost weekly on Zoom to prepare for the upcoming LASA in Bogota next year. So it's nice to see you actually in person. And thanks for inviting me here to speak about my work on Guatemala. Guatemala has been in the news lately, as you may all know, because of the surprise victory of Bernardo Arévalo, the son of Juan José Arévalo, who was the first democratically elected president of Guatemala in 1944, and who led, along with his successor, Jacobo Arbenz, what is known in Guatemala as the Democratic Spring. Series of reforms, land reform, education reform, labor reform were introduced until that experiment was brought to a quite violent end with the 1954 military coup sponsored and funded by the United States CIA. So for Bernardo Arévalo to be the president-elect of Guatemala, it's quite a historical moment for Guatemala, and he is promising the second democratic spring in Guatemala. Of course, we know that there are a cabal, or is a cabal, of non-democratic and corrupt actors in Guatemala trying to prevent him from taking office. And we won't know the outcome of this for another couple months because he's not inaugurated until January 14th. So there's still a lot of uncertainty ahead in Guatemala. So that's the immediate context of what's happening in Guatemala, which I'm not going to talk about in my formal presentation, but I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A or after. I'm actually going to focus on Guatemala's efforts to achieve justice for the mass atrocities that occurred in Guatemala during the civil conflict. One of the most brutal and enduring civil conflicts in Latin America's modern history. To start, here we go. Sorry. To start, I just want to briefly talk about how I approach my research. I consider myself to be an activist scholar or a scholar activist. I never know which is the noun and which is the adjective here. And I draw on the critical social science research that gave rise to this concept of activist scholarship. And I think you can just read that right there. It's basically the idea of using rigorous academic scholarship to engage in public policy debates, to work with local communities that are trying to affect positive progressive change. And while not all, not all academics engage in this kind of research, but those of us who do are trying to elevate, right, the significance and the importance of activist scholarship for engaging in social change and using our research and our research methods to work with communities that are embedded in systems of oppression and in their struggles to produce critical change. So that's sort of where I come from. And that image, you can see me sitting in the Guatemalan courtroom. That was in 2013. This was my first trial in Guatemala. It was the genocide trial in which the former dictator Efrain Rios Montt was put on trial for genocide. And he was actually convicted, although about a week and a half later, the Constitutional Court they didn't exactly overturn the verdict. They announced that the proceedings were being rolled back. So in effect, they undermined the verdict, but it wasn't based on any sort of new evidence or dismissing the evidence. It was based on basically a power play, right? That was my first trial monitoring experience in Guatemala. I actually started trial monitoring quite by accident. I had been researching political violence in Peru during the 80s and 90s. I wrote my first solo book was on that. And then when Peru had a truth commission, I participated in the truth commission as a researcher, and I got interested in understanding how transitional justice works. Transitional justice being these series of mechanisms that societies emerging from either conflict or long periods of dictatorship use to reckon with the past. So whether that is a truth commission, criminal trials, reparations programs, vetting programs, and then of course the guarantees of non-repetition, which refer mostly to reforms to make sure that these kinds of atrocities don't ever occur again. So I started working on transitional justice, and I really was captured by trials when in 2007, Alberto Fujimori, who was the president of Peru, fled the country. He fled the country in 2000, and no one really ever thought he would be put on trial. And then lo and behold, he was extradited in 2007. And after having written a book about him and his regime, I was like, well, I kind of want to be in that courtroom. And I just went down for the first week thinking, oh, I'll just check it out. And I was mesmerized. I was captivated to see the dynamics in the courtroom. And I have not turned back since. So I've been literally observing criminal trials for war crimes and human rights violations since 2007. First in Peru, the Fujimori case, and then another of a series of other trials. And in the last 10 years or so in the case of Guatemala. So I guess what I'd like to, before I get to Guatemala, I'd like to just say briefly why I think trial monitoring as a research practice in pursuit of the kinds of social change I was talking about a moment ago is important. First of all, the public oversight of criminal prosecutions in contentious transitional justice trials is critical for ensuring victims the right to access justice. I already talked about how I got into this project. I should just say that I started off in Guatemala working with the International Justice Monitor and WOLA, where I'm a senior fellow. And after a couple of years, I became a sort of a full-time trial monitor for International Justice Monitor, which is an open society project. And then they shuttered that project, not just in Guatemala, but all over the world. They stopped doing trial monitoring. And so I developed a little team along with my partner, my research partner, Paulo Estrada, who is himself a survivor of state violence in Guatemala. His father and his uncle were disappeared in 1984, I think it was. And we developed this sort of research collective called Verdad y Justicia in Guatemala. And we continue to this day to monitor trials in Guatemala. And so in terms of our methods, we document all aspects of the criminal proceedings, starting from the moment of arrest and a criminal accusation by prosecutors to the trial and even up into the appeals hearings. We produce accessible reports of these hearings. We analyze legal decisions, including sentences, and we track and write about other policy initiatives that might affect transitional justice processes in Guatemala. For example, in 2019, and again now, there are different legislative proposals that are attempting to impose a new blanket amnesty. So all the people who've been already prosecuted, people who are awaiting trial, and those who have yet to come to trial would be shielded from prosecution in the future. And so we document and analyze that, and we do a lot of advocacy work around that. This entails, developing close alliances with victims' organizations, with human rights groups, prosecutors working with these cases. We are constantly, I hate to even say that we do interviews because we're engaged in ongoing conversations with these communities. We also engage in situ trial observation and documentation of unfolding hearings. We systematize our information. We analyze our information. We track all the news about transitional justice going on in Guatemala, as well as international actions that might affect the transitional justice process in Guatemala. So, for example, there have been cases affecting the transitional justice process in Guatemala in foreign courts, the US and Canada, in regional courts, the Inter-American Court, and international courts, for example, the Spanish National Criminal Court. And finally, we engage in local and international advocacy work on behalf of and in support of victims' rights to truth, justice, and reparation. And I'd be happy to talk about any of that sort of methodology. It almost sounds like I have more of an NGO than a research project, and it's not quite an NGO. We don't have official status. It's really a research project that I conduct with my colleague, as I said, Pablo Estrada, and several other folks who work with us monitoring these trials in Guatemala. Let me just sort of give an overview of what I would say are my, I think my main arguments, my main, hopefully contributions to the discussion about transitional justice in Guatemala and more broadly speaking. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the details of the Guatemala case. And then I'll just flip to the map of Guatemala, so we can look at that for a minute instead of the other photograph. As many of you are probably already aware, Guatemala experienced decades of impunity for wartime atrocities committed during its 36-year civil conflict, and for more than a decade after peace accords were signed in 1996. But a series of shifts in the legal and political system allowed for criminal investigations in some grave war crimes cases to move forward, starting around 2008 and with more intensity in 2010, 11, 12, and 13. And in recent years, Guatemala has made really important strides in prosecuting the crimes of genocide, forced disappearance, sexual violence, extrajudicial execution, and other serious human rights violations. This search for accountability for mass atrocity crimes has become an increasingly central feature in global politics. There's that famous book from about a decade ago by Catherine Sikink called The Justice Cascade, that sort of was one, I think, the first efforts to really document this effort and highlighted the role of Latin America in this, the prominent role of Latin America in this process. There are these, hybrid or international tribunals, the ICTY, the ICTR, and then, of course, the International Criminal Court. We know that with the ongoing war in Ukraine, the talk of war crimes and holding those accountable is front and center in our discussion. So this is absolutely a central feature of global politics today. What's less common is for a country to, in its own domestic courts, to prosecute war crimes. It's fairly unusual, right? And Guatemala, it's kind of strange. Guatemala is not a very strong democracy. Its justice system is very weak, corrupt historically, civil society decimated after the war. A really, really rather unlikely case for there to be criminal prosecutions in domestic courts of law. But a series of things came together. And one of the things that I try to do in my research is try to explain and understand how these different threads came together so that Guatemala could, in fact, prosecute these important cases. So that's I think the main one of the main questions that I try to explore in my paper, in my project. I also am trying to understand the theoretical implications of the Guatemala case for our understanding of transitional justice, and especially for criminal accountability efforts in the wake of authoritarian rule or civil conflict. So the literature on post-conflict justice or transitional justice is really quite dichotomous in a way. There's one camp that argues that trials are critical to building the rule of law, strengthening democracy, and emphasizing their deterrence effect as a preventive measure for preventing future atrocities. And I, for many years, located myself very firmly in that camp, and now I'm a little bit not so sure, but I'll come back to that. Another camp argues that trials are costly, limited in what they can achieve, traumatizing for victims, and polarizing for societies, potentially undermining democratic coexistence. And when I said I'm not so sure what camp I'm in now, it's because I actually think that the truth lies somewhere in between these two dichotomous views. And I think that's because the impact of transitional justice trials is highly context dependent. So that drawing broad conclusions, trials are good and promote democracy, trials are traumatizing and promote conflict or perpetuate conflict, undermines our ability to actually understand when, why, and how these kinds of accountability efforts can occur and what they mean for the societies where they do occur. And they also deny a fundamental fact about efforts to account for past violence in post-authoritarian and post-conflict societies. These are never linear processes. I cannot think of a society that has really just moved from point A to point B, a point of impunity to a point of accountability, and that's the end of the story. Rather, it's a much more sinuous process with steps forward and steps backward. And Guatemala is a very clear example of that. And so I think it's important to try to understand how societies can move forward, but how there are often different groups and individuals interested in pushing back and challenging that progress. Sometimes undermining altogether, but sometimes also getting pushed back. So that it can be a very sinuous process. So now I'm going to turn to Guatemala. And here I have a little timeline just to help us with the discussion. So modern Guatemala has been ruled by a small landed elite backed by foreign investors and governments who essentially leveraged the army to keep civil unrest, and the majority indigenous population under check. The country was characterized by extreme levels of inequality, land concentration, historic marginalization, and political exclusion of the majority indigenous population. I already mentioned the brief period, the Democratic Spring between 1944 and 54, when reformers came to power and tried to fundamentally change the situation and improve the lives of working and lower classes in Guatemala. And how that effort was cut short in 1954, which then ushered in a series of military governments in Guatemala, one more brutal than the last. And especially since 1960, these military which marks the beginning of the civil conflict in Guatemala. I'll explain that in a moment. They were armed with the Cold War mission of eliminating subversion or communism, right? So in 1960, a small insurgent group did emerge against the military government at that time. Interestingly, these were mid-ranking military officers that led this first insurgency, but they were quickly defeated. And new resistance groups, some armed, some not, emerge in the mid-70s. And I'm going to kind of bring us up to the present to talk about the civil conflict, because the real period of conflict, the most intense period of conflict in Guatemala is between 78 and 85. And there's a reason for that, right? Central America in the late 70s and early 80s was a region in extreme conflict. Civil wars were being fought. The Sandinistas won a revolutionary victory in 1979, and the militaries of El Salvador and Guatemala in particular were getting very nervous, as was the neighbor to the north, right? Eager to prevent another leftist victory. So the Guatemalan military launched what Guatemalan scholars refer to as a preemptive counterinsurgency war. So in other words, just to briefly talk about that, the Guatemalan insurgency was never as strong or as well organized as those of their neighbors in Central America, and especially, of course, Nicaragua, where they won, and El Salvador, where they were very close. They came very close to winning, right? So this preemptive counterinsurgency war included scorched earth tactics against rural villages in the Western Highlands, aimed at routing out guerrilla groups and inhibiting civilian support for them, and establishing military control over the population. And again, as I already said, the most intense period of this violence was between 78 and 85. And in 1996, the conflict came to a close with a UN-sponsored peace agreement. In the context of the peace accords, there were two truth commissions. One was led by the Catholic Church and was very much a grassroots initiative. And then the UN itself sponsored an official inquiry into the violence of the war. That was known as the Commission for Historical Clarification, and it came out with its report in 1999, and here you can see some of its most important findings. 200,000 people killed. This is in a country of around 9 or 10 million people at this time. 45 of those were forcibly disappeared, 1 million forcibly displaced, many of them who fled to places like Mexico, Costa Rica, but many who also came here to the United States. The Commission for Historical Clarification determined that they documented 626 massacres, 400 indigenous Mayan villages that were completely destroyed, and they determined that 83% of the victims were indigenous Mayans, which contributed, not the only factor, but it contributed to its determination that acts of genocide had been committed in Guatemala. The UN Truth Commission also found that the military the military and its allies, including death squads and civil defense patrols, which were militias organized and controlled by the military of men in rural villages between the ages of 15 and 16. They were basically forced to participate in these militias. So the state was responsible for approximately 93% of these human rights abuses. The URNG, the guerrilla group, responsible for 3%, and they were not able to determine the responsibility of around 4%. So that's the big picture of what the violence in Guatemala looked like. So for years after the peace accord was signed, there were some efforts, right, to bring human rights abusers to justice. But the fact is that the justice system was so weak and corrupt, right, that there was no real forward movement. The handful of cases that did go to trial ended in mistrial, or there were threats against prosecutors, against the family members, and they never really culminated. The only cases in this early period that ever came to fruition really were very high profile cases, the ones involving the murder of an anthropologist, Myrna Mack, who was stabbed to death by the presidential guard in 1990. And the murder of Bishop Juan Gerardi, who was the person who oversaw that church-sponsored Truth Commission that I mentioned a moment ago. And he was assassinated 2 days after his report was made public, bludgeoned to death in the garage of his home. So violence continued unabated in Guatemala, even after the peace accords were signed, and impunity as well. So how do we understand that things begin to change around 2008, 2010? And in this period, I think it's also important to note, Guatemala has one of the highest per capita homicide rates in the world, alongside neighboring countries of El Salvador and Honduras. Some of this is drug trafficking violence, but there are also criminal structures connected to the counterinsurgency that have sort of morphed into different kinds of criminal syndicates. Some into drug trafficking, but there are other kinds of trafficking and illicit activities that are going on that are fueling this violence. And this is what leads to the creation of an international body called the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, the CICIG. Now, the CICIG is a UN body. It was autonomous. It was an agreement between the UN and the state of Guatemala. So it's a treaty level agreement. And it was sent to help Guatemala restore rule of law. Restore may be the wrong word. Establish rule of law, right? At a time of extreme violence and criminal activity. The civil society groups that were the first advocates of the creation of an organization of a body like the CICIG wanted the CICIG to also include investigations into wartime atrocities, but the power elites in Guatemala would not have that. And so the CICIG was only allowed to investigate current ongoing crimes. So its mandate did not include human rights investigations or prosecutions. But the CICIG helped strengthen, it helped reform both the prosecutor's office in Guatemala and the legal system in Guatemala, helping to generate stronger judicial and prosecutorial independence. And that's a long conversation to get into. I'll just leave it with that very brief description. How that happened is, I think, a much longer story. So it had kind of a spillover effect, right? The CICIG was sent to Guatemala to help Guatemala investigate organized crime and deal with corruption, but by virtue of helping strengthen its legal system and its judicial institutions, it also facilitated this process of bringing investigations to wartime atrocities that had long laid dormant, right, in the investigators' offices, back to life. And key to making that happen was the individual leadership of key people in primarily the Attorney General's office, first of all, but also in the judicial system. So there are key actors who, younger prosecutors, younger judges who come into office, who are determined to investigate these crimes that have for so many years not been investigated. And I think the most important one, I think probably the one you may have heard of before, is Claudia Paz y Paz. She was a human rights lawyer. And in part because of the role the CICIG played in the nominations process of judges and prosecutors, she was nominated and appointed to be the Attorney General of Guatemala. First time a woman was appointed, and certainly the first time a human rights lawyer was appointed to be the Attorney General. And so she made, combating impunity in Guatemala her number one goal, both organized crime and corruption, and the crimes of the past. And it was under her leadership that the trial against Arias, but also numerous other trials began to be investigated and brought to trial in Guatemala. And there you can see an image of Claudia. That's from 2013 when she was still in the Attorney General's office, that image of her. Another element that is important to understanding how these trials came to be is the legal activism and the pro-justice networks or pro-accountability networks that emerge and developed and continue to be active in Guatemala through all these years, even all these years of impunity. Survivors, families of victims, and the human rights organizations that worked side by side with them did not waver in continuing to document human rights abuses, filing complaints before the Attorney General's office, even at the point back in 1997 or 2000, when they knew there would likely be no action. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, the genocide trial of Arias, the first accusation in that case was filed in 2000 before a court in Spain, and then in 2001 in Guatemala. And it wasn't until 2011, under Claudia Paz y Paz, that the prosecutor's office opened the case file and said, oh, we are actually going to investigate this. And of course, it turns out that Arias was a congressman at the time. And he ended his period as congressman ended at the end of 2011. And then immediately the charges were filed. And then it went to the court system, and a judge, his name was Miguel Angel Galvez, was the pretrial judge in the case. And he ruled that there was sufficient evidence to send the case to trial. And lo and behold, March of 2013, the genocide trial against Arias opened. By no coincidence, I just should mention this, Judge Galvez, who I just mentioned, is currently one of the more than 30 judges and prosecutors who are currently in exile in Guatemala because of this anti-corruption and anti-impunity work that they've done. He also sent former President Otto Perez Molina to trial for corruption in 2015. I don't know if you all remember, there were these massive protests in 2015 against the corruption of the Perez Molina government that ultimately led to the arrest of his vice president and then his arrest as well. And they have both since been prosecuted and are in jail. And I think they're awaiting other trials as well. In fact, the party of Bernardo Arevalo, the president-elect of Guatemala, Semilla, was born in the context of those protests, the anti-corruption 2015 protests. So history is never far from the present in Guatemala. So I've laid out a little bit. Keep going to that. Yeah, I've laid out a little bit some of the reasons that have given rise to criminal prosecutions in Guatemala. I want to talk now about, I want you to just sort of look at this map, not this map, this table shows you prosecutions, convictions rather, in Guatemala over the last 15 or so years. It's not a huge list. It's not a huge list, but some of these are incredibly emblematic cases. The Rio Negro massacre, in over 200 Mayan peasants were killed in that massacre. The Dos Eres massacre, similarly, 200 peasants, I think more than half of them were children, were killed in that massacre. That was in 82 under the Rios Montt government. Plan de Sanchez, I think that was 400 people killed. The Ixil genocide, the prosecutor's office listed 1,771 victims, but we know that that's an undercount, right? We know that there are many more victims, but that was people who they could get with name, nombre y apellido, name, first and last name. The Spanish Embassy massacre, the father of Rigoberta Menchú, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, was murdered in that massacre in 1980. The Sepulsarco case, which is a case in which Maya Kekchi women, their husbands were murdered over a land dispute, actually had nothing to do with the war. They were murdered over a land dispute, and then the army enslaved the women and submitted them to sexual and domestic slavery for several years at a military base in the Sepulsarco community. So some of these are just horrifying and extremely emblematic cases that no one really ever imagined could come to trial and the perpetrators be prosecuted. So though it's not a huge list, but it is, as I said, a series of very important emblematic cases. And I have some images here I just want to share with you. Here's the genocide trial. You can see Rios Montt is the gentleman with the earphones is the former head of military intelligence, Mauricio Rodriguez Sanchez, and then 2 over is Rios Montt, the infamous dictator. This is the courtroom, the day of the verdict. I'm in there somewhere. It's hard to find. One of those Where's Waldo thing. These are the Maya Ixil people celebrating the verdict when he was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison for genocide and crimes against humanity. And as I already mentioned, the verdict was undone. It wasn't annulled because there was not a formal annulment. It was undone, right? Here's some images from the Sepulsarco trial. What I love about these images are so powerful to me. These are 15 of the women survivors who brought charges against the Guatemalan military and their allies, including military commissioners and paramilitary members. And they, as you can see, they've covered their faces to protect their identities because they're victims of sexual violence. And it's a very, I think we know that even in the United States, it's difficult for women to come forward and denounce sexual violence. And imagine in, poor rural Guatemala, it's probably even more so, right? So they wanted to cover their faces. The judge allowed it. They didn't want their pictures taken. They didn't want their pictures splashed over the newspapers and so forth. This is during the trial. And the woman whose face is not covered is the translator. And here you see their lawyers, and the woman with the long sort of light red hair is the government prosecutor, Hilda Pineda. And I want you to remember her name because I'm going to talk about her again in a minute. Here are women from other regions of Guatemala in the gallery watching the Sepulcharco trial, because they too were victims of sexual violence, and they too want to bring their cases to court, and they're accompanying their fellow women survivors. 2 military officials were ultimately convicted, sentenced to 100 and 240 years in prison. Here you see the women, when the verdict was read, and here, this is right after the verdict was read, and here you see they've removed their shawls and they're showing their face, and I just find that just very profound and very moving, that image. The Molina Tyson trial, which I didn't mention, is one case I didn't mention earlier, is another case where what's so powerful, I think, about this trial, in this trial, the 5 senior military officials were brought to trial. The trial they were arrested in 2016. The trial started in 2018. I do have an image of, let me just describe the case to you. In September 1981, a young Guatemalan woman, Emma Molina Tyson, was detained by the military. They found, documents that she had hidden in her clothes that were related to one of Guatemala's resistance movements. So they took her and they detained her, and they put her in a secret military detention center where she was tortured, subjected to sexual violence. They were trying to get information from her about her comrades, right? She was a source of intelligence, right? That's why they were trying to get information from her. And by some miracle, I won't go into the details of the story, but it is an absolutely fascinating story. After 9 days, she manages to escape this military detention center. And she manages to hail a taxi. They bring her to the safe house of one of her comrades, and eventually she escapes to Mexico, and she's like, thank God I'm safe. I survived. What she doesn't know is the following day, the military intelligence officer who was in charge of her was ordered by his superior officers to find her, because it was a major security breach for them to lose a prisoner, right? So they go to her parents' home in Guatemala City looking for her. Of course, she's not there. They find her mother and her 14-year-old brother. So they take the brother, and he has been disappeared until this day. And she doesn't find this out for some time after, because they withheld the information from her, actually, because she was recovering from her own trauma, right? So it's a dramatic story. The family for years didn't think they could get any justice. They did search for the body of Marco Antonio, the boy, never could find him. But when Guatemala returned to, when there was the peace agreements were signed, they filed a claim before the public ministry, but there was no action taken. So they ultimately brought the case to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, and then the commission eventually sent the case on to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, which is it's a great example of how the international or regional courts can pressure local jurisdictions to pursue justice. In 2004, the court found in favor of the Molina Tyson family and ordered the state of Guatemala to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible. The Guatemalan state, of course, did not do that until, many years later, 2016, the men were, this was 2004, this was what, I can't do the math, 12 years later. Finally, there are the first arrests in this case, and the arrests are, it's spectacular. That's the family. Emma is the shortest one with dark hair, and next to her is her mom, and then that's her 2 sisters. And they all have the photograph of Marco Antonio around their necks. That's the mom identifying the intelligence official who both was in charge of Emma during her prison time and who led the operation to find Emma, and not finding her, kidnapped and disappeared her brother. I'll come back. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had a picture of the of the men who were on trial. I apologize for that. 5 senior military officials were put on trial for this case, including the former head of the Guatemalan army, Benedito Lucas Garcia, whose brother was the head of, who was the president between 1978 and 1982. So it's the first time he was convicted. As four of the 5 were convicted. So it's the first time a senior military official was convicted as the intellectual author of forced disappearance and sexual violence or aggravated sexual assault. So that's another big, jurisprudence step forward for Guatemala, and I think internationally. So I think looking at these trials both help us understand how victims and why victims and survivors turn to legal activism. Not all survivors and families of victims do so, right? But those that do have attained really significant achievements in the Guatemalan case. And I just want to say this little quote that I have here, and I'll wrap up so we can enter into more of a conversation. This quote, I was interviewing Emma because when we were tracking this trial, when the first arrests were made, the accusation was only about the forced disappearance of Marco Antonio. And later on, the prosecutors amended the accusation to include the arbitrary arrest, torture, and sexual they call it aggravated sexual assault against Emma. And I was confused about that. So in an interview with her and her family, I asked her about it. She says, well, the fact is, she says, I didn't believe I deserved justice. She blamed herself for what happened to her brother. Right? So for all those years, she was testifying to the Inter-American Court, for example, to obtain justice for her brother, but she did not believe she deserved justice for herself. And she said, and I want to frame this in terms of time, the Sepulsarco trial happened in February 2016. The arrest in this case happened just 3 weeks before, on January 6, 2016. So she's watching the Sepulsarco trial on television or stream through her computer. And she's seeing these Maya Kekchi indigenous women testify about the sexual violence that they endured at the hands of the Guatemalan military over the course of several years. And she said to herself, if they can do it, well, I sure as heck can do it too. And that's why she decided to include her case in the accusation that was initially only involving the people responsible for her brother's disappearance. And that's how the head of the army, Lucas Garcia, became a defendant in this case. Because he was not initially a defendant in this case. This case, as I said, 4 of the 5 were convicted, including Lucas Garcia. They are all still in jail except one. The Guatemalan Supreme Court, in one of the examples of the rollback that we're seeing in Guatemala, ruled that one of the 4 could go under a sort of house arrest, and he was freed. Lucas Garcia and the military intelligence chief, Callejas, who were both convicted, they face charges in other cases. They both are being charged with genocide in the Maya Ixil case between 78 and 82. So they're awaiting trial for that case. And they've also been charged in the, only Lucas Garcia has been charged in the Creon Paz case, which is a mass forced disappearance case. Investigators dug up 565 bodies at a former military base in Coban. It's now known as Creon Paz. It's actually now a UN peacekeeping mission training site, which is very bizarre. But they were authorized by a judge to exhume in that area because witnesses had said that there were bodies buried in that military base, and I don't think they expected to find as many as they did, but they found 565. And so he's also charged in that case, although that case has gotten stuck in a bit of legal legal morass, for lack of other words. And I could go on and talk about all these different trials, but I think I'll just end by talking about how I tie all this up into my activism as a scholar. I don't just sit in the courtroom and then write about these things. I also engage in advocacy work in different settings. So sometimes I'll sit, in a congressional office, and I'll be explaining why the amnesty law that the Guatemalan Congress is proposing is a violation of victims' rights, is a violation of a series of treaties, and the US Congress should, make a statement about why Guatemala should not pursue this amnesty law. Or before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we'll do the same kind of conversations. In this instance, that's exactly what we were doing here. I was with, this is the Molina Tyson family, and they were they're with their legal representatives sitting at the Inter-American Court for Human Rights at a hearing to supervise the implementation of their sentence. And during this hearing, they told the court that the Guatemalan Congress was considering a bill that would essentially impose a new amnesty. In other words, and it's a very egregious bill. It's not just we're going to shield perpetrators of human rights abuses from future prosecutions. It also established that those who had already been convicted would be immediately freed. Those who are awaiting sentences would be immediately freed, and judges who fail to abide by the terms of this legislation, which is obviously a violation of balance of powers and so forth, would be subject to some fine or other sanction. So we were at the Inter-American Court documenting this hearing, writing about this hearing, and then bringing that information to the U.S. The Department of State issued a statement also urging Guatemala not to adopt this bill. And in the end, the Congress did not adopt this bill, right? But now, 4 years later, 2023, there's a new bill that Congress is considering, a different number, but the same basic contents, right, aiming to shield perpetrators from persecution. So that's just an example of some of the activist work that someone like me, who considers herself an activist scholar, would engage in connection to this broader research project on transitional justice trials in Guatemala. I think I'll just I said I think I would end with this, but I just want to say one last thing, and that is that there has been a tremendous pushback. I remember when I talked about how these are not processes that's like point A, impunity, point B, accountability, and that's the end of the story. No, there's a lot of ups and downs. And right now we're in a very dark moment where there are real concerted efforts to end these prosecutions, not just through an amnesty law, but there's been a concerted attack campaign against judges and prosecutors. And I think the international community has mostly, you'll read about this in the press, and you'll hear about how they're attacking the anti-corruption judges and prosecutors who are connected with the CICIG's work, which is absolutely true. But there is also a campaign against judges and prosecutors who were involved in these criminal prosecutions. And sometimes they're the same judges and prosecutors. Well, sorry, not the same prosecutors, but the same judges sometimes, right? And this is overlooked in the international conversation about Guatemala. And so I think it's really important to help us understand that the networks that are pushing back on Guatemalan democracy, they're trying to impose a corrupt, authoritarian political system. There is a network of actors that are behind that. It's not just drug traffickers or other illicit people engaged in illicit activities and conservative politicians. It's also the counterinsurgency military officials who were and are responsible for some of the worst abuses that occurred in Guatemala in the 70s and the 1980s. And I think I will leave it at that and invite any comments or questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
When you get called on to ask your question, if you could please just tell us who you are, what your affiliation is. I think I know many of the people in the room, but I do not know everybody.
Tired. And I must say you said it's a dark period, and it is, and it's a dark period everywhere, it seems to me, this week. But I taught a course on Central America from the time of the revolutions in the 1970s until around 2010. And the progress that has been made by activist scholars really is satisfying, because this is a much better picture than I was left with when I last was teaching on the topic.
Right.
So I'm very pleased, and I hope it doesn't get darker for Guatemala like it seems to be doing everywhere else. I have several questions, but let me just begin with one on the trial process, because you had, for example, the Molina Thyssen trial. The crime took place in 81, and it was in 2015 and 16 when the court took it. And thinking of the case of Chile, where there was a statute of limitations on homicide, so that you couldn't prosecute people who killed others. But fortunately, kidnappings are crimes that still are going on until the kidnapped person is found.
Right.
They were then able to prosecute for kidnapping in the disappearances. So I'm wondering how, in the case of homicides, was there no statute of limitations there in that case?
That's a great question, and a really important one, because retroactivity is always seen as a huge problem for these kinds of cases. However, international jurisprudence has advanced substantially and has long since established that crimes against humanity are crimes that do not have a statute of limitations. Statutes of limitations are never applied. And so you can prosecute a crime against humanity today, tomorrow, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now. Right. So that's one reason. So in the case of Chile, they could have pursued crimes for homicide if they adopted that international jurisprudence. But they were a little more conservative in only adopting the statutes that deal with forced disappearance. And I think that it's maybe they thought it was clear. I'm not sure exactly why they did that. But I think they've since overcome that. I think, and now you see Chile has prosecuted all kinds of crimes from the dictatorship, including forced disappearance, homicides, and even torture, and also sexual violence. So I think it's this idea that these kinds of crimes, international crimes of this kind, are not subject to statutes of limitation. No, and I think, when you ended your course in 2010, that was really just the very beginning of the process that I'm talking about, and it was the height of some of the worst violence in Guatemala. I don't know if you remember the Rosenberg case. He was in Guatemala. He was a lawyer who was murdered, and he left a video in which he blamed his murder on the president of the republic at the time, and it sent Guatemala into turmoil. And it was just homicides were just very common in Guatemala at that time, and it seemed very unlikely that's a process like this could really take hold. But it has been also at the same time a very contentious process, and one subject to a lot of pushback. So just that, I think it's important to kind of, put that perspective on it. Yeah.
I'm thank you. PhD student here in political science. In my own work, I also, in the way that I establish like my field work with undocumented immigrants in Colombia, I also participate with human rights lawyers. I think it's been a great niche where we can actually contribute to changing things through research. And it's also a great way to build research relationships rather than just research like data collection, right? And go beyond that. So I would love to hear your reflections about if you deal with political scientists, what the discipline could do better to form, to kind of maybe have a sense of the sort of curriculum or the sort of career track where that makes sense.
Yeah.
In addition to that, I have a couple of other questions, which you please feel free to not answer them, of course.
Let me start with that one.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Sure.
So I don't forget it. Because I think it's a really good and important question. So to be frank with you, my experience has been there are a handful of political scientists who appreciate the kind of activist scholarship that you and I and others probably in this room do. But there are also an awful lot who disdain it, who say, oh, you're not really a scholar, you're just an activist. Or maybe you're an anthropologist and you're confused. I've gotten that before as well. Which would be fine. I'm fine with that. But I do have a PhD in political science. So my answer to that is, who cares? I do what I do because I believe in it. It takes its cost. It has a cost because this kind of research, if you're really dedicated to it, the activism can eat up your life and your time, leaving less time for you to write that book or that article that is so important for your promotion and tenure. So if you're untenured, which you're still a student, so I would say get tenure first, or I did not listen to this advice myself personally. When I was invited to work for the Truth Commission, it was my second year as a tenure track professor, and I was like, well, this opportunity doesn't come around but once in a lifetime. I'm doing it, and so what if it makes me take longer to finish my book? Well, it created a lot of pressure for me when I was ready to go up for tenure to get that book done. Otherwise, I was not going to get tenure. So there are definitely things that you need to think about. If you are on an academic track and you want to be tenured and you want this to be your profession, you do have to abide by whatever the norms of your institution are to get tenure. Just because you're doing great, activist work, they're not going to care. They're not going to care. So you have to find that balance. And sometimes it's very difficult to do that because you get so wrapped up in the human drama that whether it's with, undocumented immigrants or racial justice issues, or in my case, transitional justice issues. These are people living and breathing terrible circumstances, oppression of all kinds. And it's just very easy to get wrapped up in that. So you have to find a balance. I don't know the solution to finding the balance. It's, I think it's a very individual thing. But connecting with other folks who do activist scholarship, I think for me anyway, has been very helpful because it's given me models and examples to follow in my own work, so that I avoid the pitfalls while still being able to do what I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's really good. I think it's an important reflection to have. And thank you for that, for the candid answer, the complex answer. The other questions I had was one, how much were other Latin American activists, maybe people from Argentina, involved? Either providing advice or encouragement or training in Guatemala. I mean, obviously Argentina is like the case where crimes against humanity and military dictatorship were tried in country, right?
Yeah.
So I think, Argentine civil society has spread. The Argentine forensic anthropology team is in Mexico, for example, and they've basically created civil society's capacity to critique the government's lack of search for disappeared people. So I don't know. I was wondering if there are if there's a Latin American network in Guatemala, and specifically Argentines, because I think that would make sense. Second is, this is obviously a Cold War context. Have investigations led to U.S. Like the U.S. Embassy or U.S. support? I think a lot of the issues around historical memory in Latin America is that the abuses happen in a Cold War context, but the accountability ends in Latin America, and it doesn't go back to the U.S. when it should. And maybe also other countries. Maybe it's also the Soviet Union and Cuba, and in some cases where there was also abuse from the part of like insurgent groups or guerrillas. Then I think this is totally worth it. I'm on the side of like historical memory and trials, etc., and prosecuting crimes of the past. But in the case of Guatemala, how much does it not draw the actors who are either connected or who were guilty or involved in these crimes back into politics? Like in Guatemala, I think there's these, you still have the figures of the military past who participate in elections, right? Is this creating an incentive for them to not leave formal institutionalized political party type politics. And what does that do to the country? I mean, it's a trade-off. I'm not saying it should stop because of that, but how much is that the case? And the last, and I'll shut up. What can international institutions or other organizations do to isolate judges from threats and pressure? And please just feel free to answer whichever questions you feel.
Great
could be
question. Okay, so learning from the Argentine or other experiences, whether we're talking about forensics or domestic criminal prosecutions, I think there have been really interesting learning exchanges. The first learning exchange I remember ever participating in was of truth commissions. So there have been, I remember when Peru was discussing how to set up its truth commission, there were a couple of different international seminars where they brought over people who had participated in the Truth Commission in El Salvador, in Guatemala, Argentina, Chile, and South Africa to talk about, what works and what doesn't work and why, and what should this process look like? How can we make it more effective? How can we make it more innovative? And I think there's those kinds of learning communities on all these different things, from prosecutions to forensics, to truth commissions, probably also reparations programs, though I've not studied that as closely. And there are also international, for a long time, the ICTJ International Committee on Transitional Justice, which is based here in New York, which was founded by people who participated in the South Africa Truth Commission, became very active in sort of, sharing experiences and lessons learned from different countries around the world. So I think that kind of sharing has been really important overall. Yeah, I would just say that it's hard to say. I wouldn't say that Argentina defined the model and then everyone is just following the Argentine, because I don't think that's true. I think each country has pursued its own path while trying to learn from other countries at the same time, because there are a lot of differences in how each country has pursued these different paths, right? Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the Argentine model is something that everyone is like looking to. I don't find that in Guatemala. To be honest, I don't find that most people in Guatemala actually know what's going on in Argentina, right? There's not a lot of good information about these trials. Do you know how many people have been prosecuted in Argentina, for example? Convicted, I should say. Over 1,000. I don't have the most recent number. It's over 1,000. It's amazing. There should be a lot more articles written about that. And we just don't, it's just not, I don't know why it's not interesting. I think it's fascinating, right? Anyway, do investigations stop in Latin America? They do, unfortunately. For the most part, for truth commissions and in criminal trials, right? Truth commissions, you'll recall that the Salvadoran Truth Commission, after it put out its report, De Locura a la Esperanza, didn't have a single line about the role of the United States in supporting the successive military regimes of El Salvador and the death squads of El Salvador, not a line.
I wasn't going to criticize, whoever, just people. But when my daughter was doing her thesis at Harvard, she discovered that whenever the United States began to have a presence in a country, human rights abuses went up.
That's fascinating. Well, that's really fascinating. So let me just answer go back to your question, because when there is a criminal prosecution in the traditional criminal justice system, responsibility is, I don't know how to even say this, it's all coming to me in Spanish. It's individualized. We can only put on trial an individual. We can't put on trial a government or a policy. That's for the history books in theory, right? Chile, I understand, did once try to have Henry Kissinger extradited for his role in the war crimes committed in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship. But of course, that's never going to happen. And it didn't happen. right? And there's a reason the United States government has not signed on to the Rome Treaty, and we are not a member of the International Criminal Court, because we refuse to subject ourselves, our citizens, to a potential international criminal prosecution, right? So it's hard to say we, support human rights and rule of law, and we don't support war crimes when we ourselves are not willing to submit to the international institutions that are being developed precisely to combat war crimes, right? So it is a question I'm often asked, right? Especially in the case of Guatemala, where the role of the U.S. is so clearly documented, right? In the 54 coup, in supporting the military governments that committed these atrocities. You'll recall there's a wonderful film. If you've never seen it, I'm pretty sure it's still on Prime. It's called Finding Oscar. And it's about the Dos R's massacre, for which there are now 3 convictions. Well, several people, but 3 sentences for that trial, that massacre in Guatemala. And 2 young boys were survivors of that massacre, and they were each adopted, quote unquote, by 2 different military officials who engaged in the murder of their families. One was 3 and one was 5. The 5-year-old remembered everything. 3-year-old remembered nothing. And they had to find him. And they actually found him here in the United States, living in Framingham, Massachusetts. And the film is about their search for this boy, who's now a man, because they needed, he's evidence in the trial, right? And there's a scene in that film where you see Ronald Reagan, he's in a room like this, a lot of people in the audience, and Efrain Rios Montt, the dictator of Guatemala, waltzes across the stage in a full-on white 3-piece suit, looks like a disco king, and he shakes Ronald Reagan's hand, and Ronald Reagan proceeds to call him a great Democrat and said he's gotten a bum rap on human rights and so on and so forth. So, we were quite complicit. And it's interesting, if you go to the National Security Archive and look at the work of Kate Doyle, she's documented what the U.S. knew at that very moment about Guatemalan military human rights abuses. We knew it all. It's in reports. You can go online. You can go to the National Security Archive website and look online and read the documents and read what was being reported from the diplomatic missions at that very moment. So we knew. So it is a huge question. And it seems to me that is a problem that Americans, as in US citizens, have to grapple with. But we seem to have a challenge, I would say, with accountability for these kinds of issues. Going, from Guatemala to Abu Ghraib and beyond, right? There was a trial in Abu Ghraib, but it was the direct perpetrators. What about the lawyer who wrote and signed the document authorizing enhanced interrogations, which is a synonym for torture, right? So, yeah. I could say a whole lot more about that, but I'll leave it at that. So I do think that there is a tension, and I think you saw this really clearly in Colombia. I'm not an expert on Colombia, but Colombia was recently involved in trying to sign a peace deal, which they ultimately did in 2016 between the FARC guerrillas and the Colombian government. And there was a huge discussion about how do you get a guerrilla movement to agree to put down arms if you're also threatening to prosecute them, which international law mandates. And so in the Colombian case, they came up with a series of procedures to encourage not just guerrillas, but also members of the military and other, including paramilitaries, to confess to what they did. And if they did so, they would get reduced sentences. And maybe they wouldn't even have to do real time. That's not necessarily satisfying to me, but the alternative is continued war. So maybe it is an imperfect but acceptable solution. Again, I'm not an expert on Colombia, but I think that's a really good example of how a country has tried to grapple with exactly that question, right? In the other angle that you're talking about, though, it's the Guatemalan military guys, right? they had stepped it down from power, from formal power, by the time these, except although Perez Molina, who could have been prosecuted for, could still be prosecuted for the Maya Shield genocide. He was a commanding officer under Rios Montt. There is video of him standing over dead bodies in Nebac. I mean, it's, you know, there's quite a bit of evidence there, but he was president, but he ended up getting prosecuted for corruption. So I'm good with that. I mean, you know, but it's not an easy question to answer. And that's politics. That's why it's so contentious, I think, precisely because many of those people in the Guatemala case, it's less the case of Perez Molina where they're in official government capacity, and it's more that they are involved in other kinds of criminal networks and enterprises that have power and access to powerful people that then pressure to bring these cases to an end. And that's what we're sort of seeing now in Guatemala. Right. So that is still very much happening. And then your last international support for judges. Oh boy. I don't know that I have a quick answer to that, but there needs to be more of it. You know, I mean, the Inter-American Court and Commission have a mechanism, and the commission has a mechanism called precautionary measures, and the court has a more extensive mechanism called provisional measures that they grant when they deem someone's life is in imminent danger. And several of the prosecutors and judges in the cases I'm talking about have been given these measures. Judge Galvez, who I talked about, who sent Rios Montt and Perez Molina to trial, who was overseeing the military diary case, and then there was this massive attack against him. He had precautionary measures from the commission, and in the context of this new campaign against him, the court granted him provisional measures. So in theory, the state of Guatemala was required to provide better protection for the judge, but the state of Guatemala is currently, you know, governed by a corrupt cabal of these elites that I'm talking about, and so the hostilities against him did not cease. The threats increased, the death threats increased, and he ultimately resigned his post after 25 years as a judge, and he's now living in Costa Rica in exile. So these precautionary measures they're important, but if you have states that are inherently corrupt and don't give a damn about the international ramifications, the U.S. could play a much bigger role, I think, especially in Central America, where the U.S. plays such a fundamental role. Right now, the U.S. is playing a really important role in trying to get the current regime to accept the election results and allow, which is bizarre. It's to say that they can allow. They want to make sure that Arevalo is inaugurated on January 14th, but for the last several years, they've kind of turned a blind eye to this very government and allowed it to accrue so much power, even though they've engaged in all kinds of corruption and illegal actions, criminalizing judges and prosecutors, journalists. The most important journalist in Guatemala, Jose Ruben Zamora, has been in jail for over 1.5 years on absolutely trumped up charges. That's Guatemala right now. So when you have a government like that, these precautionary measures they're hardly sufficient. But I don't have the answer as to what the alternative should be.
It's really a pleasure to have you here. I'm Stephanie Golub. I'm a professor at Baruch and at the Graduate Center, and I direct the initiative for the study of Latin America at Baruch. So I have my question. I want to take you back to your lit review. I want to take you back to the question about viewing the literature as being sort of bifurcated. You know, between the people that think that the arc of bends towards justice and those that don't. Because something that is very interesting here is thinking, you know, the kind of persistence of looking for legal means that victims are looking for, you say, legal activism in a country in which you could argue, unlike Chile, which had a very strong legal culture that would lead you to believe, well, of course, people, they had the persistence to look to the legal because they believe that Pinochet and the junta were going to leave power because that's what the military had done before in Chile, right? They came in the 30s, they left because that's what they do as a constitutional. But I don't see this sort of legal culture in Guatemala. So I'm interested to know, this, it seems to me that that's an interesting puzzle, right? Is it because of learning from other countries? Well, I don't know. I mean, the role of international actors in Guatemala also, because CICIG, there was lots of hope, but then there was tremendous backlash against CICIG. It became the focus of like, this is a foreign body inside our country kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So could you speak a little bit about this, the shift toward legal activism and why you see yourself in between? You said in some ways it's about context specificity. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So that's a really, I love the question. And I think that you're right. There is no real tradition of legal activism in that way in Guatemala. But I think it has to do with the question of what else can they do? What can victims of atrocities do in a domestic jurisdiction? They only have one recourse, and it's legal. I mean, they can write books, they can help, they can create memorials, and they do that also. But many of the victims of the conflict in Guatemala are very intent on justice. And I think my understanding of the way they understand it is that it's seen as a way of righting the wrong, number one, but in number two, of claiming their rights as citizens of the nation state. Right? In a country where indigenous people are treated as the other, as less than, as, I don't even want to say it, but right? Claiming that they are citizens and they have the right to be heard by a judge is probably one of the most powerful things they can do. And, it's interesting, Guatemala never really, you think about other countries like Rwanda. Rwanda pursued, there were these gacaca courts, local level courts that were meant as an alternative to the formal justice system. Guatemala didn't have anything like that. Perhaps because the nature of the violence was different. It was much more fratricidal in the case of Rwanda, whereas it was very much state directed in Guatemala. But I think that's the reason. That's what I hear people saying to me in any case.
The desire was that they needed to have a response from the state.
Yeah. They were not, and also it's also a mechanism of truth telling, truth getting, right? Because a lot of times there's no information. Like the 45,000 disappeared in Guatemala. The state's not just handing over files and telling people where they are. The only way to try to get any information is to litigate. You litigate for the case files. There are some documents that have been made public because they were found, the police files were found mysteriously, and they've since been indexed and archived and are accessible to people, although there's been some contention around that recently. But overall, military documents are not available. So people have sued to try to get access to them, brought cases to the Inter-American Court, and one of the recommendations is I was an expert witness before the Inter-American Court like 10 days ago in Colombia in a Guatemala case about 4 indigenous peasants who were disappeared in 1988. And they've never been able to identify the perpetrators because the Guatemalan government and military refuses to hand over any information about the battalion, about the commanders who were at that battalion, about the military structure at the time, about what the reports that were filed at the time. They say it was all burnt, the documents were all burnt. And so what recourse do the families have to vindicate the memory of their loved ones? Again, not everyone does this, not everyone, because these legal proceedings, I mean, they're timely, they're costly, they take forever. Sometimes they result in nothing. The Creon Paz case is it the one where I mentioned earlier with the 565 bodies. That case is just stuck in a legal limbo, and the families are waiting and waiting, and they've been waiting for a really long time. Yes, which is one of the more interesting and innovative aspects of the Guatemalan justice system. And I think one of the things that's helped push these cases forward a little bit.
That's a think about that also. And the other piece that I was thinking about is you mentioned that, about the that 2008, 2010, that whole piece that there were lots of young people that were in the legal profession. So I'm interested in, was there and was it of indigenous people there in terms of the young generation? What we see like sticking back to the website is read about what's happening, trying to sending young from getting seated in the parliament, they're judges, right? So you can't say that there was like a wholesale in Chile and justicia and judges and educating and changing, but you still have a lot of very conservative judges in Chile as well. So in Guatemala, I'm thinking that there's this maybe there was
it's interesting to compare Peru and Guatemala. Peru has also a fairly large indigenous population, not quite as large percentage-wise as Guatemala. But I'm hard-pressed to think of an indigenous human rights lawyer, an indigenous prosecutor, or an indigenous judge. Very hard-pressed. Guatemala, I see it all the time. The Maya Achi sexual violence case was litigated by 3 Guatemalan women lawyers. They were the representatives of the victims. In the Sepulsarco case, no, she was not Guatemala, she was not indigenous, but she was a young woman, Gila Paneda. She's now been removed from her position as the head prosecutor of the Human Rights Unit in Guatemala for the same reasons, right? So there has been that in Guatemala. It's very interesting. Not something I've done a lot of research on, but I definitely see it. Yeah.
The time option now I'm seeing several generations of young women in 2010, in the 20s, the 30s, and then the generation. So I'm very interested in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great
So
set of
I
questions.
wanted to, sure, go ahead. If you could tell us who you are.
Hi, Marco Castillo from, I'm a student at the sociology department. I just wondered if you can briefly mention some, outside of litigation, other successful or not successful policies of transitional justice, such as, reparations, symbolic reparations, and even collective type of approaches of reparations. Such as, for instance, lustration, that is very important in thinking about the Cold War context and the post-Cold War context of this. Lustration has been very big in Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah.
As part of their, going away from communism. However, in Latin America, that has not been the case. So could you comment a little bit on that and thinking about these differences and similarities between these two contexts that can kind of serve as case studies, perhaps, on comparative cases of this more broader context. And then I didn't want to ask more than one question, but I noticed that you said that there was some controversy about the archives in Guatemala. I am actually researching the terror archives in Paraguay.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I was interested in understanding what more you have to say about these more controversial, perhaps, things may have happening there.
Let me take the last part first, because that's a little
Absolutely,
easier
yeah.
to answer.
Thank you.
So I forget what year it was, maybe 2008, 9, 10. There was this explosion in Guatemala City. And when the police and investigators went to check it out, they discovered this massive archive belonging to the Guatemalan National Police that had literally just been abandoned. And fortunately, there's, very good Guatemalan civil society organizations and international civil society organizations working with the Guatemalans. And they were able to develop a project to sort through those documents and begin indexing them and digitizing them and eventually making them available to prosecutors and to the public. And up until a couple of years ago, you could actually go to, it's called the Historical Archive of the National Police, the AHPN, and you could go to their offices and they would give you a tour. They would show you how they index things. They would show you how they digitize things. They would give you examples of how documents found in this archive have been used in criminal prosecutions. I mean, and they've also been used to help people identify, maybe not the full story of what happened to their missing loved ones, but some aspects of the story, right? A couple of years ago, as this backlash was ongoing, the head of the archive, who was a leader of a former resistance organization, was accused in a criminal case, and so he fled the country because he was fearful of being prosecuted. My understanding, these are completely trumped up charges, right? And the archive was shut down. There was an international outcry. So the archive is not public. You can't just walk in now and ask to be given a tour or look at the documents. But my understanding is that prosecutors and investigators can still access the documents, but it's very restricted. It's not open the way it used to be because there's an effort to close that space. Kate Doyle, who is at the National Security Archive, has done a lot of work on the archive. And there's a really beautiful book written by Kirsten Weld it's called Paper Cadavers, on the archive. So those are two experts on the archives that I would very highly recommend. So there's that. The other question was about other transitional justice policies that were successful or what. Well, I mean, in Guatemala, there was an interesting reparations program that was set up during prior governments, but then sort of the successive governments literally ignored it. And so it doesn't really even exist anymore. It's called the Programa Nacional de Resarcimiento. But interestingly, some of the sentences that have come out of Guatemala's courts it's not just a conviction, but it also orders reparations. And it's not just a monetary reparation. Sometimes it is collective and symbolic reparations as well. And I think they're kind of following the model of the Inter-American Court, which does a similar thing. So in the Sepulsarco case, it's kind of like the classic example in Guatemala. The court, they convicted these two guys, sentenced them to jail. I don't know that they ordered monetary reparations to the women. They may have, but they probably did. But they also ordered that the state provide healthcare to the women and to their community, because they recognize that these are women inserted in a community, right? And so they provided, they're ordered to provide healthcare. They were ordered to build a school, build a clinic. They also ordered the state to restore the land to the community that was the original source of the conflict. That they have not done, but they've done the other things. So some of the reparations have been implemented, but not all of them have. And that's not unusual, unfortunately. But that to me is a really interesting example of how there can be reparations beyond just individual economic reparations, right? And Peru has similar collective reparations programs, similarly because the violence was done against individual people, but it affected a broader community, right? I can say that. That's about all I can say about that, I think, at this point. Sorry? Oh, lustration. Yeah. The only example that I can think of is when the Salvadoran Truth Commission believing that it would be impossible to prosecute anyone for human rights violations in the Salvadoran case, included a list of the names of individuals it had determined were responsible for grave human rights abuses, and asked the state of El Salvador to prohibit them from participating in public office for, I don't remember what years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever it was. And I understand that that was applied in some, but not all of those cases. There is some debate, like some people in the literature question whether that's, a lack of due process and whether they should have done that. But they did it, and that was the only case of lustration that I'm aware of in Latin America. Oh, I should say Argentina, civil society groups have been very good at taking on the role of vetters. So when there's, when a military official is up for promotion, they will conduct research into this individual's past and vet him. And if this person there are, credible allegations of involvement in human rights abuses, they will bring this forward. And recently, someone who had a past like that was appointed to a senior commander position, and the human rights community went bonkers over it. But it stood. But for the most part, they've had a lot of luck in using civil society and legislative procedures to vet. It's not an official vetting process the way one would perhaps like to see, but civil society in Argentina is extremely active and has really taken on that role. And I would say CELS, the Centro de Estudios Legales y Sociales, has been sort of the leader in that. And they have a whole, I don't know if they still have, but they had a whole research unit on civil military relationships. And that was part of what they were doing. I don't know of any other, and in Peru, a presidential candidate in the most recent election was a war criminal. He was just recently convicted. He was on trial while he was running for president, lost, thankfully, and then later on he was convicted. He's no longer the most recent president of Congress. He's never been convicted, but I'm pretty sure he was a war criminal. So that's what happens when there's no investigation and prosecution, is that these folks reinvent themselves. And in Guatemala, they've mostly reinvented themselves as corrupt criminal networks, although some went into public office like Pérez Molina. In Peru, they're like heads of Congress trying to be president and whatnot. So it's really quite striking. It's quite alarming. I don't know that prosecutions solve that problem. Vetting would probably be a much more effective way, but it really has not been. I don't even know that it's been well studied in the Latin American context. I can't think of a single study that's looked at that issue in Latin America. Maybe in specific cases, but not as a policy per se. I can't think of a single one.
So I wanted to look a little bit more towards the future and ask you, what are the prospects of Bernardo Arevalo being actually inaugurated? And then if he is inaugurated, what are the prospects for human rights and what you've been analyzing in the context of his administration?
That's a good question. The Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemispheric Affairs from the United States is about to head to Guatemala. And my assumption is he's going to be pressuring the current government to back off on their concerted effort to prevent Arevalo from taking office. Because what they're trying, first of all, when he surprised everyone and made it into the second round in the June 25th elections, they tried to prevent him from even running in the second round elections. That didn't work, and there was a lot of big international outcry in support of the election results. And when he won, he won by almost 20 percentage points in the August runoff. So he has a pretty strong mandate, right? But what they're trying to do is they're trying to claim, and by they I mean the the Attorney General's office is the one kind of leading the investigation, the quote unquote investigation into Semilla, claiming that when they registered as a party in 2015, they had falsified signatures, because you have to get so many signatures to be able to register as a party. And therefore they're disqualified from being a party, then therefore Arevalo is disqualified from being a candidate, and therefore he can't be president. It's absurd on the face of it, right? There's still a long way to go. So I'm reluctant to say absolutely he's going to be inaugurated on January 14th, because that's still almost 2 months away, right? A lot could happen between now and again and then. But the international community has made a very strong stance in support of, the need to uphold the will of the people and the election results. And I think this is resulting in a bit of a fragmentation of that alliance that's been running things in Guatemala the past several years. And that's the key. If the alliance continues to fragment, then people, it's going to be like rats running off a stinking ship. And then the elites who are in control of those key institutions are going to be hard pressed to keep doing what they're doing. So I'm still optimistic. A lot of people that I know are still very optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic. And then we get to the question of, once Arevalo, let's say he does he is inaugurated on January 14th. He has a long road ahead of him because he does not have a majority in Congress. These right-wing corrupt parties have a majority and can easily thwart his legislative agenda. He was in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks ago, and he said that he made a comment that I thought was worth repeating. He said, in fact, we don't really have parties in Guatemala. We have our entities that are controlled by certain individuals. And when they realize that the floodgate of corruption is being closed, which is what I'm going to do when I come to the presidency, they're going to have to rethink their positions. And maybe we can then build a broad alliance, like, government of national unity kind of thing, and build a legislative coalition. It's ambitious, but he sees that as the way forward. He could probably still do some things without having a legislative majority, but it would be really hard.
And his control of the apparatus of the state in terms of human rights, how much can he accomplish?
Well, he's already said, he's already talked about, so under the current President Giammattei, the institutions, the peace institutions that were established by the Truth Commission, by the peace accords, were basically eliminated. And he created a new institution that it's just a shell. It doesn't do really anything. So he's already signaled that he will restore, if not restore the old institutions, at least make this new institution functional. And if he does that, then in theory, human rights and these kinds of processes will be supported. But the real challenge is going to be restoring independence in the prosecutor's office and in the judiciary. Because right now, the judiciary has been completely infiltrated by corrupt actors. And one of the main things that CC did when it came in 2007 was start identifying corrupt judges and prosecutors and getting them removed. And so there's going to have to be something akin to that, assuming Arevalo can take office. And he's going to have to do it without an international body, unless he can somehow get some other, UN support or some other kind of support to back him, right? It was easier to do back then because the UN was there and had such a presence in Guatemala. Now, yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you so much, Jo Marie.
Thank you all for coming and for having me. I really appreciate it.